Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening with our keynote speech given by Michael Maul, intendant of the Leipzig Bach-Fest and a researcher of the Bach Archive.
Welcome, and I would like just to present Michael Maul. Michael Maul studied in musicology at the University of Leipzig. In 2006, he completed his award-winning dissertation on Baroque opera in Leipzig at the University of Freiburg. And Christoph Wolf supervised his dissertation. Then in 2013, he completed his prize-winning habilitation thesis on the history of the Leipzig St. Thomas School. And then he has been member of the research team of the Bach Archive in Leipzig since 2002. And since 2018, he is also the artistic director, intendant of the annual Leipzig Bach-Fest. Maul is internationally renowned for several astonishing Bach discoveries during his last decade, including the unearthing of the previously unknown aria and Bach's early surviving musical manuscripts. His publications include a wide range of articles on German Baroque music in the 17th and 18th century, especially on J.S. Bach, and he is a member of the Directorate of the Neue Bach-Gesellschaft. During 2014-15, he has been a visiting professor at the Peabody Institute of the Johns Hopkins University at Baltimore. So please, Michael Maul, welcome and thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me and thank you very much for this nice introduction. Bach and Italy, what a great and what a multifaceted topic for a conference which, because of the corona pandemic, has had to flee into virtual space and now brings together Bach friends from Italy and all over the world online, despite all the difficulties we are currently facing in the real world. It is both a great honor and a great pleasure for me to be invited to give the keynote lecture at this conference. But first of all, I would like to say a big and heartfelt thank you to you, Chiara Bertoglio and Maria Borghesi. It is really incredible that you both have managed to put together a conference of such size and diversity in these difficult times. I'm sure you know that this summer I actually wanted to celebrate a huge gathering with Bachians from all over the world at the Leipzig Bach-Fest under the motto, Bach, we are family. The virus has made this project impossible for the time being. However, both of you and your entire team of organizers of Bach and Italy are showing with this conference in an exemplary manner that the Bach community cannot be torn apart even by a pandemic. Bach beats Corona, yes, that's true, and you provide striking proof for it. With the opportunity to create closeness in virtual space that is currently not possible in the real world, we can build a bridge to Johannes Vassenbach himself. For all of us, Bach is considered an incredible composer who lived 300 years ago in a completely different era, but who at that time found in his works a musical language capable of speaking to people across temporal, confessional, and geographical boundaries. And yet, nobody will disagree that Bach would not have become what the composer Bach is to all of us without the encounter with the Italian taste and the music of Italian composers. Bach's influence by and his encounter with Italy, however, was something that also did not take place in the real world. As we know, Bach's feet have never carried him south of Karlsbad in the north of Bohemia, which is still far away from Italy. In other words, his encounter with Italy also took place only virtually. Unlike Heinrich Schütz, Georg Friedrich Händel, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, or Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, Bach never undertook an Italian journey. And yet, he studied Italian music carefully and used it to model his own Bachian style. Bach and Italy, yes, this was without any doubt a long-lasting affair, an affair that was mainly possible because Bach was able to gain access to the repertoire of Italian composers from distant central Germany again and again. He literally inhaled it and thus was able to adapt and assimilate old and newest developments in Italian music. In my keynote, I would like to take a stroll through Bach's life and his prominent engagement with the Italian style. I have divided the keynote into 4, so to speak, acts, ranging from the youthful organ player Bach to the aged Thomas Cantor Bach. For Bach and Italy was a lifelong affair. So let's start with the first act. Act 1, turning into Signore Giovanni Bastiano Bach. The teenager Johann Sebastian Bach was a, so to speak, music eater, a young man who learned with fiery enthusiasm, following the goal to become a great virtuoso on the harpsichord and on the organ. At the age of barely 15, he was already studying the most difficult organ music of his time, orienting himself on his great idols, the North German organists Dietrich Buxtehude and Johann Adam Reinken, as well as on the works of his Lüneburg teacher Georg Böhm, his great uncle Johann Christoph Bach, and the compositions by Johann Pachelbel. Their works dominated, according to all what we know, the playlist of the teenager Bach. Some of Bach's great role models had traveled much further in their lives than Bach himself. Pachelbel, for example, studied in Vienna and exchanged letters and musical materials with Italian virtuosos. However, they too had not studied their art in Italy. Nevertheless, in their keyboard and vocal music, whether in the various ostinato forms or in their contributions to polyphonic or free-formed compositions, their engagement with the music of leading Italian composers is clearly visible. Through his engagement with Buxtehude, Pachelbel, and Reinken, the teenager Bach thus became acquainted with the principles of Italian keyboard music, so to speak, at second hand. One could argue whether he was aware that some of the musical genres, such as the chaconne, passacaglia, or toccata, which he encountered in the works by these German composers, were of Italian origin. But at least Bach's second oldest son, Carl Philipp Emanuel, remembered, as he reported in a letter to the first Bach biographer Johann Nikolaus Forkel in 1775, that his father, I quote, loved and studied the works of Frescobaldi in addition to the aforementioned German composers. Just how much it was clear to the young Bach that many of the musical genres that fascinated him were of Italian origin is demonstrated by the fact that within the few surviving autograph manuscripts from this early period, as well as sources from his closest environment, he wrote work titles very consistently in Italian and even Italianized his name. You can see it behind me. Yes, even in a recently discovered fair copy of his Toccata BWV 914, and even in his two earliest surviving autographs with Lutheran cantatas written in 1708 in Mühlhausen, Bach called himself Signore Giovanni Bastiano Bach. Besides his aria variata alla maniera italiana, BWV 989, also written around this time, the Capriccio sopra la lontananza del frato dilettissimo, BWV 922, for harpsichord, is, in my opinion, the most striking example of how the young Herr Bach considered himself a Signore Bach. This composition, probably composed around 1704, 1705, is a kind of program music for the departure of the beloved brother. The Italian title of the work is a mystery to posterity. Who was this fratello? A beloved brother in spirit, perhaps Georg Erdmann, a former schoolmate who in 1700 together with Bach moved from Ohrdruf to Lüneburg, or a physical brother, perhaps his former Ohrdruf teacher Johann Christoph Bach, who copied the Capriccio into one of his keyboard notebooks. Or was it Johann Jakob Bach, J.S. Bach's other real brother? The latter indeed left central Germany in 1704. He entered the service of the Swedish court as oboist. In any case, the Capriccio certainly has a direct model in the so-called biblische Sonaten, biblical sonatas for harpsichord by the Leipzig Thomas cantor Johann Kuhnau, published in 1700. All in all, however, both the genre and the entire musical arrangement taste just as Italian as the titles of the piece and some individual movements. In the sixth movement piece, Bach describes the various emotional states of those left behind. At the beginning, there is a, I quote, persuasion by friends to keep the traveler from his journey, into which the signal of a stagecoach sounds from afar. This is followed by, I quote, an imagination of various incidents that could happen to the traveler in a foreign country. Then an adagiosissimo is sung, called a general lamento of friends in the manner of an Italian passacaglia, followed by the official farewell of the beloved brother. Finally, the sound of the horn of a stagecoach is celebrated. Its characteristic signal provides the theme for a very snappy aria di postillone. We are going to Act 2, Crazy About Vivaldi. We make a leap in time, almost a decade ahead. Bach is, since 1709, court organist in Weimar, the most important court in Thuringia. Here, Bach takes advantage of the court's good international connections and studies, as many preserved copies prove, eagerly modern French organ music. In 1714, he even copied note by note Girolamo Frescobaldi's perhaps most ambitious publication, the Fiori Musicali, published in Venice in 1635. This famous collection by Frescobaldi combines toccatas, including a chromatic one, curia movements, canzonas, capricci, and ricercare. In other words, musical genres which also playing a particular role in Bach's own work catalogue. Bach's musical enthusiasm was greatly encouraged by Johann Ernst and Ernst August of Sachsen-Weimar, the two nephews of the reigning Duke Wilhelm Ernst. Both installed a lively musical practice in their small residence, the so-called Red Palace, Rote Palast. This was where Bach and his cousin, the Weimar town organist Johann Gottfried Walter, were constant guests, tuned the instruments and gave the two musical princes lessons in instrumental playing and compositions. The court's account books testify that the two princes between 1708 and 1713 spent considerable sums on copying music. Certainly, their huge music library contained a large amount of what set the musical fashion at that time between Rome and London and between Paris and Prague. Perhaps this also included those Italian cantatas by Francesco Conti, member of the orchestra at the Imperial Court in Vienna, and by Antonio Biffi, music director at St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, which both Bach copied in Weimar at that time. In any case, these pieces should have contributed their part to Bach's appropriation of the principles of the da capo aria and to the fact that his melodies, formerly rather short-winded musical themes, now turned into more vocal, linear motifs. In any case, musical life in the Red Castle received a new stimulus when the 16-year-old Prince Johann Ernst returned home from his Cavalier tour from Holland and Belgium in April 1730. Apparently with suitcases full of new music. Philipp David Kreuter, at that time a student of Bach, reported in a letter to his hometown Augsburg, I quote, "Now it is fitting that the young Weimar prince will come from Holland to Weimar after Easter and stay here for the summer. So I could soon hear some beautiful Italian and French music, which would be very profitable for me, especially in the composition of the concertos and overtures. In addition to the local castle organ, will also have reached such a good state of repair by Whitson that Mr. Bach will certainly play incomparable things on it." End quote. Bach well may have soon produced quite incomparable tones on the organ in the palace church. Music that had never been heard in the church before and whose performance was certainly connected to the young prince's Cavalier tour. So let us listen briefly to a musical example. we just heard in Bach's arrangement for organ is in fact pure Vivaldi and comes from his Opus 3, L'Estro Armonico, a collection of 12 violin concertos published in Amsterdam in 1711. In these pieces, Vivaldi had established his epoch-making concerto form of ritornellos and solo episodes, tonal centers, and endless rows of sequences. And with this musical style, Vivaldi, so to speak, infected an entire generation of composers, also in Weimar. Since here, around 1713, a veritable Vivaldi mania broke out. The young prince, Johann Ernst, intensified his composition lessons and now composed his own concertos in the Vivaldi style. And both J.S. Bach and Johann Gottfried Walther transcribed several Italian instrumental concertos. By Vivaldi, of course, but also by Torelli, Albinoni, and Marcello, for organ or for harpsichord. By doing so, J.S. Bach automatically adopted the principles of the modern Italian concerto, consisting of tutti ritornellos and solo episodes, principles that Bach would take as a starting point for the modeling of his own instrumental concertos some years later. But Bach would not be Bach if he had not immediately attempted to mix the newly gained insights into the Italian instrumental music of his time with the German organ tradition. This might have happened as early as May 1714, when the organ in the castle church after renovation sounded for the very first time with a new wind chest and a mighty 32-foot pedal stop. It is quite possible that Bach composed the great F major toccata BWV 540 for this occasion, a work or a piece in which he begins very similar to Vivaldi in the D minor concerto that we just heard, with two voices competing with each other by imitating each other strictly, and in which he used an explosive mixture of Vivaldian figurations in order to completely exhaust the manuals and pedal of his organ. Perhaps still in Weimar, but at the latest during his time in Köthen, Bach developed his own concerto style on the basis of his encounters with Italian solo concertos. Evidence of this is provided by his violin concertos and his legendary 6 Brandenburg concertos, compiled in 1721. These group concertos, or as Bach wrote, concerts avec plusieurs instruments, are in many respects based on the concerti con molti strumenti established by Vivaldi. And yet, in their polyphony, the so to speak democratic-looking equal treatment of all instruments and the experimental forms, the Brandenburg concertos offer the central example of how, in Bach's case, style adaptation was immediately followed by assimilation. In other words, the 6 Brandenburg concertos offer, so to speak, Italian vegetables provided with an enormous portion of Bachian spices, and the result is a distinctly mixed taste. Talking about mixed taste, we now have to jump into the third act of my paper. Act 3, learned in the Italian style. We are now in the year 1735. Bach has been Thomas Cantor in Leipzig for 18 years. After a breathtaking start, when in just 4 years he composed almost 150 Lutheran cantatas, his 2 Passions and more church music, he apparently stopped composing new church cantatas on a regular basis. For 6 years, he has been director of a Collegium Musicum, which performs twice a week in Zimmermann's coffee house, not only music by Bach himself. Some Italians are also placed on the music stands of Bach's Collegium Musicum, such as concerti by Pietro Locatelli, cantatas by Nicola Antonio Porpora, and by Alessandro Scarlatti, and certainly many more works of Southern European provenance, which, however, have not survived. In 1731, Bach had also begun to publish printed Klavierübungen, keyboard exercises. His Opus 1 provided 6 technically extremely demanding partitas for harpsichord. Each of them is a multi-movement collection of highly sophisticated dances with a rather French character. The relatively large number of copies of the original print of the Klavierübungen 1 that have survived to this day makes it clear that the pieces have spread far beyond Leipzig and central Germany. And this is reason enough for the Thomas Cantor Bach to continue the series of the Klavierübungen now in 1735 with a new volume that is similar and yet quite different from part 1. According to the title, it includes a concerto in the Italian gusto, taste, and an overture in French style, for 2 manual harpsichord. With this second part of his Klavierübung, the now 50-year-old Thuringian Johannes Vassenbach presented himself as a real European, who virtually explored the musical map of Europe from central Germany throughout his life, full of curiosity. And above all, he presents himself as one who was playfully able not only to adapt the 2 leading national styles, the French and the Italian, perfectly, but also to mingle them with his typical Bachian idiom. Indeed, what Bach puts down on paper with the great overture in French goût and the concerto in Italian manner is simply a demonstration of the unique artistry of a true musical cosmopolitan, both in terms of his ability to adapt style and in his use of technical and compositional finesse. For here one can find at its finest what Johann Joachim Quanz, the flute teacher of Frederick the Great, will present 2 decades later as the great achievement of the leading German composers of his time, and what Quanz so aptly called the mixed taste. I quote from Quanz's famous instruction to play the flute traversière. I quote, "The Italians used to call the German style in music un gusto barbaro, a barbarous style. After it had come to pass, however, that some German composers went to Italy and had the opportunity to perform some of their works, the prejudice gradually diminished. Yet it must also be said that the Germans have much for which to thank the Italians, and also in part the French, due to this advantageous transformation in their taste. It is well known that some great masters have permitted many of their composers to travel to Italy and France, and that many of the improvers of the German taste have visited either one or both of these countries. If one possesses the necessary judgment to choose the best from the musical styles of different countries, the result is a mixed style, mixed taste, which one, without overstepping the bounds of modesty, could certainly call the German style. not only because the Germans came upon it first, but also because for many years it has been established in various German places and continues to flourish and pleases its audience in Italy or France or any other countries. Quote end. While the great French overture in B minor takes up stylistically roughly where Bach had previously left off in his 6 partitas, the concerto in Italian taste is a solitaire in his surviving oeuvre. For here Bach presents a concerto for harpsichord which offers the competition between a tutti ensemble and a soloist in the Italian style, only that not a whole orchestra is disputing with the concertist, but the harpsichord must fill both roles alone. This interplay is made possible because in the Italian concerto, Bach composes tutti ritornelles in the style of a piano reduction, so to speak, and in between he sets solo episodes in which the theme is fancifully continued. At the same time, he makes use of the dynamic possibilities of the 2-manual harpsichord, because with the indications forte and piano, he marks very precisely in the score where the player must change manuals in order to imitate the typical tutti solo contrast of a concerto with orchestra accompanying. The result is breathtaking. It tastes distinctly Italian and yet is completely Bachian. Of course, Bach does not leave it at the typical standard form of a concerto movement, which was created by Vivaldi and in which tutti ritornello and solo episodes can be clearly distinguished from each other. Rather, Bach repeatedly crosses this traditional boundary, allowing the individual motives in the dense contrapuntal setting to cheerfully argue with each other. And despite all the complexity, he manages to compose both vocally and catchy, something that Bach did not always succeed in doing. In short, the Italian concerto is a stroke of genius that Bach prompted even Bach's harshest critic, the music journalist Johann Adolf Scheibe, to see in the Italian concerto by Bach from Thuringia a masterpiece that sets new standards in the genre of the solo concerto, standards that could hardly be surpassed by others, and allegedly not even by the Italians themselves. I quote from Scheibe's review. Finally, I must mention that concertos are also written for one instrument alone. There are some quite good concertos of this kind, particularly for clavier. But preeminent among works known through published prints is a clavier concerto of which the author is the famous Bach in Leipzig. Who is there who will not admit at once that this clavier concerto is to be regarded as a perfect model of a well-designed solo concerto? It would take as great a master of music as Mr. Bach to provide us with such a piece, which deserves emulation by all our great composers and which will be imitated all in vain by foreigners. End quote by Scheibe. Okay, we are jumping into the last chapter, chapter 4 or act 4, and we are jumping at the same time into the last decade of Bach's life. Performing Pergolesi's immortal Stabat Mater. The few surviving sheet music materials on Bach's church music of the late 1740s testify to the fact that Bach, despite the imminent loss of good health, continued to work with great curiosity and a desire to experiment. At some point around 1746, Bach was eager to perform the famous Stabat Mater by Giovanni Battista Pergolesi, a piece that Pergolesi had composed in 1736, a few months before his death at the age of only 26, and which only became publicly accessible when it was printed in 1748. Since Maria's Song of Sorrows had no place in the liturgy of Protestant worship, Bach was very inventive. He copied the score and underlaid Pergolesi's notes with a paraphrase of Psalm 51, Tilge höchster meine Sünden, which in terms of his metrical form is completely based on the original Latin text. We know nothing about the responsible anonymous poet and if the text was actually commissioned by Bach himself. But in the end, it is obvious that Bach must have been really interested in being able to perform this special music in Leipzig, even if he had to change the text completely. At the same time, Bach did not leave it at a simple performance of Pergolesi's score either. Through the selective addition of an independent viola part, he expanded Pergolesi's score to a 4-part instrumental setting. Even though this piece will be the subject of an entire lecture in our Bach conference, I would like to give you at least a brief impression of the sound of this Bach arrangement of Pergolesi's Stabat Mater. With this remarkable arrangement, which was apparently even the very first performance of Pergolesi's Stabat Mater in Germany, the circle to the young Bach is complete. Even though I could by no means address all the examples of Bach's active reception of the Italian style and of Italian composers in my keynote, the journey throughout Bach's life makes it clear that Herr Bach did indeed have part of his musical roots in Italy. In other words, a German who knew his Italians, studied, admired them, and derived important impulses for his own compositional works from their music. The extent to which the works of some Italians were central models for Bach is demonstrated not only by his transcriptions, the aforementioned adaptations, his various fugues on musical themes by Albinoni and Bononcini, and the fact that he apparently taught his students the art of basso continuo by using musical examples from Albinoni. Just how much his art was also based on the achievements of the vocal polyphony of a Palestrina was shown by Bach in his opus ultimum, the Immortal Mass in B minor, in which he linked the classical vocal polyphony, especially in the choral movements of the Symbolum Nicenum, by using the Stile Antico. And not least because of this, he left a work as a legacy that, as the Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI recently wrote to me, I quote from his letter I received last summer, a work not only transcends the confessional boundaries of a period, but also touches and will continue to touch the whole of mankind now and forever. End quote. In short, Herr Bach was also Signore Bach throughout his life. Far from any nationalistic fantasies, Bach was a true musical cosmopolitan. That is to say, a composer who acted completely independent of territorial or confessional boundaries, musically speaking at home in Venice, as in Paris or in Leipzig. Certainly, this musical openness was not singular, but a trademark of many contemporary composers with a European perspective. Among the German composers, it was Georg Philipp Telemann in particular who brought the ability to adapt and synthesize style to the extreme in his works. For example, when he presented a linguistically mixed libretto, German, Italian and French, in his Hamburg opera Orpheus, and changed the musical style according to the language completely. In addition, Telemann, unlike Bach, spoke an excellent Italian. But what Signore Bach has left us in terms of works that have been appealing and inspiring people not only from all over Europe, but from all over the world for generations, well, that is probably unparalleled. And now provides us with plenty of material for a major conference and the subject of Bach and Italy. Good luck, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Michael Maul, for your wonderful presentation and for this exciting travel across Bach's affair with the Italian music. And thank you also for these kind words about our work and our staff. We would like to remind our listener that this lecture will remain available on the web for further consultation.
And tomorrow we will have another full day, as you'll be able to see on our conference program. So once more, thanks to you all. Good night and see you tomorrow.
Good night.